Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for having invited me to this august conference and to say a few words about Swiss asset management from vision to internationally recognized brand. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you may have had the same experience yourself. Someone you know asks you, in what industry are you working? Your answer, I'm in asset management, is met with a blank stare. The stare is not the result of some negative stigma, but rather highlights the lack of knowledge the general public has about the asset management industry and the role of asset managers in their lives. I like to use the image, and you see it on the next slide, the image of a bridge to illustrate what asset managers actually do. Asset managers are intermediaries. They form the bridge between investors' needs and the investment universe. So on the next slide, maybe. Yes, here we are. And the investment universe. Let me explain. The investment universe can be broken down, as we all and you all know, into two rough areas. One has investments such as shares of listed companies or corporate and government bonds, which are open to all investors. This part of the investment universe is also referred as to the public markets. The other part is known as, roughly, private markets. And these investments are generally only available to more professional kinds of investors. Now, private equity investments are found here, for example, real estate and infrastructure, hedge funds, and many more. As diverse as the investment universe is, so too are the needs of the various client groups the asset managers actually serve. These groups include pension funds, insurance companies, private investors, family offices, and investment fund companies, just to mention a few. It's a very broad a very broad set of clients, and you see them here, actually to the right on the picture. In their capacity as intermediaries, asset managers understand the opportunities and risks involved with the various asset classes and know what their clients actually need. With their expertise, they provide their clients with access to investments, select investments and instruments for them, and manage these investments on their behalf. All the while ensuring proper diversification and managing investment risk with the aim of generating, and that's a crucial word, a suitable return. Short, fulfilling their fiduciary duty. The goal of asset management, to achieve discretionary investment performance, is a valuable contribution to society. Just think about pension schemes. The very low interest rates for risk-free assets make it increasingly demanding for pension schemes managers to achieve the returns that are necessary to cover pension liabilities, as we all know. Asset managers help them to cope with these challenges, amongst others. And last but not least, varying client situations often mean that asset managers tailor investment structures to meet individual client requirements. This can be necessary in order to implement and define investment strategy in the best possible way, bearing in mind the specific regulatory situation of a client or a client group. Asset managers are also involved in other activities, of course, such as taking care of distribution, or providing advice. It was mentioned before, doing some studies in order to avoid any overlapping. However, I shall focus on the core activity of generating discretionary investment returns. That's what asset management, in my definition, stands for. Referring to the bridge image helps to illustrate the role of asset managers. In my experience, once people start to gain some clarity around what the definition actually means, they become tangible, sparking some interesting conversations, as you can easily imagine. The question about disintermediating balance sheets and all these questions, because if you look at the right and you look at the left, there is one part owing money, there is another part needing money, and what you do in between is nothing else but financing projects in order to generate returns. But that's another story altogether. If I take a look around me now, I see people who work in banks, insurance companies, asset management boutiques and others, such as those who work for pension funds. No matter where you provide your asset management services, however, one thing remains true. We are all asset managers. We are all generating investment returns. This means we invest money that does not belong to us, that we are under a fiduciary obligation to our clients, and that we are supervised by our relevant regulators. It is certainly not wrong to say that asset management is a service in its own right. It can only be provided by proven specialists. Despite this, ladies and gentlemen, in Switzerland, asset management is often perceived as being merely a subsidiary activity within the financial industry. It is traditionally and understandably, given past developments, overshadowed by other areas, especially of banking, wealth management, corporate banking, mortgage banking, and retail banking. Or it is even equated with the manufacture of certain investment products like funds. This perception of asset management, partly due to the universal banking culture in this country, prevented the Swiss to establish their own distinct asset management culture and brand. That is a pity in a way, in my view, as it means that the Swiss Financial Centre has maybe missed an opportunity. Swiss asset management could represent as a brand a high level of reliability, independence and quality at the highest international level, which could be leveraged to open up new growth prospects for Switzerland as a financial centre. Let me explain my vision in some more detail. First, the question is, of course, is establishing Switzerland as an internationally recognized top location for asset management even worth the effort? And just so you understand me correctly, I'm not talking here about any sort of Heimatschutz or protectionism to make this place flourishing for itself and by itself. The aim is to have a location where there is a thriving international competition at the highest level. A location where the world's leading asset managers, wherever they are located and wherever they come from, want to be, and from where they want to make their investment decisions. That's what the goal must be, in my view. Now, a financial centre is made of various players. Switzerland's financial centre has a strong banking component, and, as you have no doubt noticed, this segment has lately faced some headwinds. We therefore clearly need additional growth opportunities for our financial centre. And this is where internationally recognized Swiss asset management comes in. A recent study carried out by the Boston Consulting Group highlights the growth potential of asset management in Switzerland, and I quote from the study: "Full realization of the additional opportunities with the inclusion of asset management initiative could increase annual revenues growth in this business area by 3.9 or 4% by 2018. It is clear, however, that realizing the potential described here requires considerable efforts." Unquote. I'm not afraid of these efforts mentioned by the study and the authors, and I hope you are neither. The building up the country as a location for asset management would involve very little in the way of reputational or systemic risk, and would tie up very little additional capital resources, but would probably generate a stable and long-term upward trend in earnings. In addition, the asset management business is highly scalable. It's probably at its core of its economics raison d'être, the scalability of the business. It's highly scalable, and managing additional assets within existing strategies just involves minimal additional cost, as we all know. And last but not least, money that is booked and managed in Switzerland generates more value added in Switzerland than money that is, as it is today, often the case, merely booked here and managed abroad. However, these insights must be discussed with and made clear to all stakeholders in society. The, at times, unpleasant public debate, also in Europe, pertaining to hedge funds, for instance, or private equity, shows that where ignorance or incomplete knowledge prevail, mistrust and general disapproval will quickly take a hold. I strongly advocate the remedy of proactively engaging in dialogue and ensuring transparency and clarification in a timely manner to ensure any stakeholder debate is factual and relevant. It is one thing to have a conference amongst friends, as here, and it is another thing to talk to a wider public where there are probably people who are a little more skeptical about what asset managers do and what they don't do. So we must engage also in the dialogue with these circles in society. But now, I think we all agree it's worth the effort, but how realistic is implementing such a plan? Or to put it in another way, what prerequisites does Switzerland already have in place and which are maybe needed to succeed? Now, let me start with the advantages. One major advantage Switzerland has compared to other countries is the very high level of assets already managed here, over proportionate to the country, especially on the institutional side and on the wealth management side. This is a trump card. It is vital to keep looking after these assets. That means offering asset holders and managers the best possible service and doing everything in our power to ensure that these assets can continue to be booked and hopefully managed according to best practice, and that this is not impeded by, say, political guidelines, be it for pension funds or sometimes investment funds. The leading position in cross-border private client business is yet another advantage, adds to it, that Switzerland has as a location, and it should not be forgotten that the financial center continues to enjoy an excellent reputation, in spite of all the adverse happenings, in precisely the places where new wealth is being created, be it the BRIC countries and other emerging nations in Asia and Latin America. At the same time, the implementation of open architecture needs to be rethought. Instead of off-the-peg third-party products, it might make sense to offer proprietary products in Switzerland managed by third parties. And the scale of the individual positions held, and I know what I'm talking about, would probably also justify the assets being managed of these products here in Switzerland instead of other locations. There are still advantages of Switzerland as a location which make it easier to implement an asset management growth strategy. Next to the assets, which I just mentioned before, these advantages are the stability of the country's political, economic and currency environment, its central location within Europe and the proximity it offers to the client base, its international focus, the availability of a skilled labour force, in addition to a well-developed underlying financial market infrastructure. Having said this, I would, however, advise that we take care of these advantages. They are still here, but as we all know, politically there is a lot of talk, there is a lot of action, which is not always in favour of these advantages. And I think Switzerland does well in being aware of its strength and defending its strength. My conclusion is, however, a positive one, therefore. Switzerland has a good, perhaps even excellent prerequisites for establishing an internationally recognized asset management center. What we must not do, however, is gloss over the series of challenges that would constitute obstacles in developing asset management in Switzerland. A leading asset management location stands out through its performance culture. A vital part of this is also recognizing and honoring performance. A top asset management location will never be established through mediocrity in performance generation. However, not all asset owners live a performance culture in this country. It is rather the case that in certain areas, investors or regulators superimpose on their investment policies and regulations other objectives that are sometimes maybe a little bit political in nature. Something that, over the long term, is neither in the interest of beneficiaries nor of society as a whole. Aging societies, ladies and gentlemen, such as in Europe and Japan, must supplement their pension finance through pay-as-you-go systems with private retirement savings and or capital-backed pension funds. A certain level of performance has to be achieved to ensure that the capital-backed pensions can make this important contribution to financing worry-free retirement years. This is not possible in the current market environment without taking on some amount of risk. This yields the yields of the so-called risk-free government bonds are currently lingering around a record low. Hence, investing pension capital into government bonds alone will not result in sufficient real returns over the coming years, as we all know very well. This means we must seek investment strategies that have higher performance potential, of course, with controlled risk, in order to allow capital-backed pensions to make the required contribution to financing a carefree retirement for the beneficiaries. Against this backdrop, an absolute cost focus when selecting an investment strategy is probably too narrow a perspective. The cost-efficient implementation of beta strategies is certainly a worthwhile approach. However, this is not enough. Pension funds must and should systematically tap new sources of return for their beneficiaries. This especially includes investments in growth areas wherever those can be found. The establishment of a performance culture in Switzerland is not only a prerequisite for establishing a top location for asset management, it is also a social necessity. Namely, what I have just explained, given the demographic challenges in many parts of the developed world. Our society needs performance to fulfill its social obligations. It's a very simple statement. Now, the role of the regulators, that's another point, is also important in the establishment of a top location for asset management in Switzerland. A one-sided focus on investor protection would probably have to give way to a more holistic assessment of the investor concerns. In addition, providing support in the establishment of an internationally recognized asset management location in Switzerland can and must be a duty of a regulator also, next to the other duties of protecting customers, investors, and the system. Likewise, required are effective specifications for organizational measures which will be binding on asset managers in the prevention of conflicts of interests. Now, the fundamental rule in regulation should always be, and you know, as much as necessary and as little as possible. I must say, however, we see very encouraging signs in this respect. Efficient, transparent, internationally recognized and effective regulation through legislation and codes of conduct also allows market access to be secured or maintained in such a way that services and products from Switzerland can be offered and thus exported in other countries, be it in the European Union or further afield. Bearing this in mind, I wonder what will be the outcome of the consultations on the FFSA or the FINIGIA laws now discussed in Switzerland, in German FIDLEG or FINIG. Now, dear ladies and gentlemen, I said at the beginning of my speech that large parts of our society are not aware of what asset managers, many of us here, actually do. Let's change that. Asset management is a growth opportunity for Switzerland's financial centre that fits perfectly with the new regulatory environment of tax-compliant and transparent fiduciary investment. Let's recast asset management in Switzerland with a new positive meaning and show what added value Swiss asset management can offer to all stakeholders in society. Let me sum up. To achieve the goal of establishing an internationally recognized asset management location in Switzerland, there is quite a lot we have to do. We have to start by taking care of the assets we already manage here, be it pension assets or be it private wealth. Regulation must be industry-friendly in the sense that, next to protection, it also enhances and allows the establishment and the flourishing of an industry in the international competition. It must be geared to international standards to enable us to export Swiss asset management products and services. Concomitant with this, a distinct performance-oriented asset management culture, honoring performance and knowing what it means to perform, must emerge and grow in Switzerland, parallel to all the other endeavors. Let's work together in turning this vision into reality for the benefit of the whole society. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Schlatter, for sharing your insights on how to brand Swiss asset management. Ladies and gentlemen, we have time to take one question or two questions from the audience. Are there any questions you'd like to direct to Mr. Schlatter? Yes, over there. We have a microphone, I guess.
Let me use one of your last sentences. Regulation must be industry friendly to form my question. Is regulation industry friendly right now with what's happening in the European Union, with what's happening in the United States? Kind of an open-ended question, I know, but to kind of maybe focus on that. Thank you.
I'll gladly do so. And frankly, it's like beauty. It lies in the eye of the beholder. It has something to do with the perspective you're taking. I see certain areas where I personally think that maybe the regulation that is on the way, not yet decided upon yet, maybe shoots over its purpose. And I'm quite open. I think in the recent FIDLEG draft, there are elements which I think go beyond what's actually reasonable for a financial center and also go beyond what's the standard in other countries. On the other hand, I also see, due to my global role, other countries where regulation in certain areas is even stricter than the one we have here in Switzerland. So what I would say is what we have to do is, it has to be a plain level field. That's important. We should understand what others do. We should make sure that by, taking that over, we generate access for our services to these countries and regions as well. But we should maybe avoid to go far beyond what the international standard is, especially in the asset management industry, because I think it's not worthwhile doing much more. That's a little bit my view on this, yes.
Okay, thank you. Is there another question from the audience? One more over there, the gentleman with the red tie, just behind, 2 rows behind, yeah.
Hi. During your speech, you stressed the point of delivering good return, good performance. Now, in the market you have several products, several types of investment. I'm referring more active versus passive products. So where you see that the asset management industry in Switzerland can provide added value in both sides of this the market, or would you be focusing more on active product, passive products? And what's your definition also of performance? Will it be just returns or a comprehensive service?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let me answer your second question first, right? I think what's important is, if we talk about asset management, and I try to give a definition, that's simply because if we don't specify the object we're talking about, it is very difficult to find consensus and to define a strategy, because people are understanding different things under asset management. That's why I said, let's focus on asset management equals the fiduciary, discretionary generation of investment returns. Now, of course, they are most of the time defined ex ante, so they're measurable, right? It's not arbitrary, but that's actually what it is. I would exclude in this definition, obviously, all the add-on services, right? Like advice and so on and so forth. That's one thing. Second question is passive versus active, the eternal question. Look, passive, certainly, from an economic point of view, and I don't enter into the academic question whether active management is possible or not, right? Because you find studies there which actually prove the one or the other, depending upon where you come from. But on the economic side, we must admit that scales are, of course, huge on the passive side. Not sure whether Swiss players have established enough scale to actually make in the future a good living on the passive side. given that cost on the passive side is actually the main driver. Right? So margins are probably going to fall even further. So I'm not sure whether that is alone, or could be alone, a pillar for Swiss asset management. So I have an inkling that it probably needs some more thought into the active side, where we can generate something beyond the ordinary, beyond markets. I would probably advise to go into that direction if I had a choice.
Okay, thank you. Last question. Just the last question from the audience. At the very end.
Thank you. Maybe concerning your last point, market access, Europe, of course, but other parts of the world, what would be, according to you, the best scenario in the next year for Swiss asset manager? Which development should we see on the regulatory side that would enable institutional Swiss asset managers to do their business in Europe and abroad in general?
Well, I think this has something to do with the definition I gave for asset management. And this is also a logical consequence of the definition. If you define asset management the way I just did, what's important is to get access for the services you provide as an asset manager. i.e., you must be able to sit here in Pfäffikon, Schweiz, and manage a UCITS fund, an AIF fund in Ireland without any restrictions, or an Italian pension fund. Right? That's what, if you give that definition, should be the aim. That's what we must ensure. Now, if I look at recent regulation, for instance, AIF, and many of you know, it first looked a little difficult. It now looks better. We will now see what's happening on the level 2 regulations, on the different country-by-country regulation. But I think as long as we can actually do investment services out of Switzerland into, for instance, the European Union, that would be the best scenario. UCITS will now follow, UCITS 5 and 6. If you define asset management broader, then you would of course say, I'd like to sell funds, Swiss funds, in other countries, which is a totally different story. And frankly, there I'm a little more skeptical that we will achieve this without any limitations soon, to be quite frank. So I think it's the better strategy to go for the services and not for the products.
All right. Thanks once again,
Thank you
Mr.
very
Schlatter, for sharing your insights, for you, ladies and gentlemen, for your questions. I'd like to continue with 2 questions, but not to Mr. Schlatter, but to the audience. You just need to say yes or no first. Have you heard about the initiative Asset Management Switzerland that was launched in November 2012 by the Swiss Bankers Association and the Swiss Funds and Asset Management Association, SFAMA? If this is the case, please raise your hands. So, many people know this initiative. Have you heard about results of this initiative or first achievements? If this is the case, please raise your hands as well. I can see a couple of hands, 3 or 4. That's not the problem at all. We have Mr. Peter Grünblatt with us today. He's the program manager of this initiative, Asset Management Switzerland, with the Swiss Bankers Association. Before joining the Swiss Bankers Association, before taking over that position, he held from 2001 onwards various management positions within Credit Suisse Group. So